Hey everyone, Dan Johnston here. I am the Jack of all ministries, and today I am going to talk about the 10 struggles that I faced during the planning phase of my studio. Okay, so the 10 things that I struggled with when I was planning for the studio that you see behind me now. I want to talk about this today because I think that, basically if anybody's out there working on a studio, you're probably going to run into some issues, particularly in the planning phase, because the planning phase is one of the most important and stressful parts of the project. You want to try to think of everything you can at the get-go so that you can prevent some headaches in the future. And so what I'm going to do is I'm going to give you the 10 things that I struggled with in the planning phase. I'm going to talk about what I did to correct those things or to get around them. And then I'm going to talk about how well it worked out in the end. And hopefully that'll give you some inspiration or some direct advice at how you can approach the problems in the planning phase of your own studio. So the first challenge I want to talk to you guys about was the fact that I have this breaker box and a drain line on the same wall. The reason that's a problem is I didn't want to move the breaker box and I really didn't want to move the drain line, but they both had opposite sets of restrictions. If I was going to leave the breaker box in place, it was sticking off the wall at about 4.5 inches, and I needed the drywall to be installed behind it. For the drain line, I needed the drywall to be installed in front of it, and it was coming off the wall at 5 3/4 inches. So I had to figure out, am I just going to cover up the breaker panel? Am I going to kind of square off the wall by, 1.25 inches or whatever it is? Well, what I decided to do was actually bend the wall. The wall actually kind of goes in at an angle. You really can't tell that the wall is bent unless you're either kind of standing above it looking down at the baseboards and you can see that the baseboard is not straight. You can kind of see a little bit of a crease in front of the drain line, but really not much. And then, of course, the biggest struggle that I have now, and I'm going to have to fix this in the future, is that when I put my window box in place, the window box is flat, the wall is curved, and you can see where they don't line up. So I'm going to have to take out the window plug and kind of bend that surface after I mess with the framing a little bit of it, to make it look like it's a clean line. I could also shave down part of the window plug, but I don't think I'm going to do that. I'd rather just bend it. I think it was the right solution, though. The truth is no wall in your house is going to be perfectly straight. If you've ever done any drywalling at all, you know that when you mud something up, it's going to change the face of the wall. There's just no way around it. You're always constantly trying to build things out or feather things out so that it looks flat, but really no wall, especially if there's a seam, is ever going to be flat. And then when you look into the corner of a room, you're always building up mud there. So really any wall you have is going to be a little bit off because that's just the nature of working with drywall. So overall, I'm happy with it, and it's actually kind of nice to have the breaker box in the room because if I leave my air conditioner running too long, it will tend to kick out the breaker, so I can just do a quick reset on it. The second problem that I faced in this studio was the fact that I had plumbing and stairs hanging down off of the ceiling. And this was something that I spent a lot of time thinking about, trying to figure out exactly what I was going to do. Now, the first thing I did was I decided to put a soffit around the stairs because the stairs are going to have to be there no matter what I do. But the interesting challenge about the stairs was trying to figure out if I wanted to just soffit around the stairs or if I wanted to soffit all the way across to keep things symmetrical. Well, what I did was I called a guy named Dennis Foley from Acoustic Fields, and I told him what I was working on. And when I gave him the dimensions of the room and told him it was going to be a drum room, he said, if you asked me the one thing to never do in that room, I would say record drums. And it was like, okay. Well, it doesn't matter. This is the room I have. And so that's what I was doing. And so I said, okay, so what's better? Do I want the symmetry of having a wall go all the way across, or am I better trying to keep the room bigger by keeping volume by not soffitting next to the stairs? And he said, at that point, just try to keep as much space in the room as you can. And that's what I did, and honestly, I don't regret it. Even though the soffit is only in the corner, it doesn't feel like it affects the sound. When I'm editing videos, it has never bothered me. I never feel like one speaker sounds different than the other. And it might be on some microscopic level, but for what I'm doing, I think it works out pretty well. As for the radiator pipes that were hanging down, I was really nervous about relocating those because I'm from California. I don't know anything about radiator heat, and so I didn't know if I was going to run into something with the pipes or the water or the balance of pressure in there, some kind of a seal or chemical. I didn't know anything about it. So I just wanted to leave the radiator pipes where they were. So I went ahead and softened over that, but it's really only like a 2.5-inch drop into the room, hardly even noticeable. And it kind of creates a little bit of a sense of separation in the room, which I think is actually nice because I feel like I have my workstation on one side and my drums on the other side. As for the main water line, though, I felt very confident that I could just cut out the copper, replace it with some PEX piping, and that's what I ended up doing, and that was very easy to do, and it was totally worth it. Relocating pipe is very, very simple when it's just water lines and stuff like that. So I went ahead and I did that, and honestly, it makes the room seem cleaner to not have another soffit running across where the main water line was or trying to hide it in the wall or something like that. And so I'm really happy with the way that that part turned out. The third challenge I had to face kind of runs along with what I mentioned before about what Dennis Foley said about the size of the room, and that's that the size of the room was a problem. I was making a place where I wanted to record drums, and as I said, Dennis Foley told me that a 12 by 8 by 7.5 foot space is not really conducive to record drums in. Why? Well, because drums, you have a kick drum and you have toms that play really low frequencies at really high volumes. And basically what he told me was when you start getting into the 30, 50 hertz range, you start getting sound waves that are 30 feet apart. And if you're trying to stop those, you need roughly 30 feet worth of space. And so I don't have that here. So I had to do what I had to do. And so what I did was I tried to max out what I could. I took the room all the way to the point where I couldn't really push into the hallway anymore. On the ceiling, instead of boxing in more space, I ended up using resilient channel up there to create an isolation point between drywall and the joists to help prevent sound transfer, impact noise. And so I did that to save space because resilient channel is only 1/2 inch hanging down versus trying to reframe into the room. The other thing I did was when I framed on the inside walls, I used 2x3 studs. Now, 2x3 studs aren't necessarily the best thing to use for soundproofing, and I'll talk to you about that in a little bit. But actually, because I had concrete walls behind 3 of the walls, it was really not that big of a deal. And so it actually was able to bring in some more sound control into the room. And 2x3s saved me, 1 inch all the way around on every wall. Overall, though, I'm really happy with the way that it turned out. Yes, there are some low frequency issues in the room, but they're not as bad as I thought that they would be. Honestly, I've been able to keep them under control, and when I record things, I think they actually sound pretty good, especially when you consider the size of the space. And as for soundproofing, for the most part, things are soundproofed in here. Yes, you can hear the kick drum. Yes, you can hear the toms outside of this room on the next floor. But my wife says that it doesn't really bother her. It's quiet enough to where it's just more background noise than anything. And that's really what I was worried about. My dog seems to run around just fine, and she's not terrified of the sounds or anything like that. So I'm overall really happy with the dimensions of the room because there's just enough space to have a desk and drums in it, and it has not caused me any problems so far. The fourth challenge that I face is one that any of you may be facing if you're building in a basement, and that's that I had sloped floors. Actually, you can see in this room that it actually drops by almost 5 inches from one corner to the other because the main drain of the basement is located right where my studio is. Now, fortunately, there are other drains located throughout the basement, and so if water was ever going to become an issue, I'd be able to handle it in other places. So really, it's just this one spot where there'd be an issue, and I designed it in a way to where I could quickly grab a drill, punch a hole through the bottom floor, and it'll drain right out. But the bigger challenge, studio-wise, was what is this room going to look like if I build it on a slope? I install my drum set and my cymbals and everything are all leaned and cocked to the side because I'm on a sloped floor. That was not something I wanted to do. So I went ahead and I built a deck on the floor that raised up as minimal as possible to keep it level. Now, a lot of guys, what they would do is they would just frame out a new floor. But the problem is that's going to raise your floor up by at least 3 inches. And I didn't want to invade any more airspace into the studio. So what I did was I went to the highest point of the room and I installed the plywood flush against the concrete in that corner. And then what I did was I raised everything else all the way around the room. So I basically took a level, went all the way around the room, marked off where level should roughly be, and then I started installing the framing lumber. So what I did was I took some 2x4s and laid them on their sides at the lowest point of the room, and then I laid them out level until I got to the point where the floor was going to start raising that 2x4 out of level, and I stopped there. Then I installed another 2x4 on its side and ran that across again until the floor started raising it out of level. And then I took a 1x, I laid it on its side and ran that until it was going to be out of level. So basically I had these spines that kind of ran across the room at different heights. Ultimately, it worked out great. I had no problem with it. There's no squeaking on my floor. It feels solid. And then it also gave me an opportunity to put some insulation underneath there, which actually helped me with soundproofing. The biggest advantage to adding this deck into the room was by the door. Now that I have a raised deck when you walk in through the door, that actually allows my door to close against the deck, which gives me a much better seal than just trying to put a door seal underneath the bottom opening. And that has been one of actually the best things for soundproofing in my room. The next challenge that I wanted to mention was something that basically, if you're building a studio in your house, is probably something you're going to have to deal with too, and that's that I had a window in the basement. Basically, anytime you're adding to a room that has a door or a window, you're going to have some trouble. While doors are pretty much unavoidable in a studio because you have to get in and out of it, windows are not necessarily so. And so because mine had a window already built in, I decided that I was just going to plug it up. But I didn't want to plug it in a way that was permanent, because if we ever decide to sell our house someday, people are going to want to be able to see the window from this room. Not only that, but sometimes I like the idea of having some sunlight while I'm getting some work done in here. And so what I did was I made a window plug, which was basically just a little bit of framing filled with insulation and then capped off on both sides with some MDF. Now the MDF overhung the frame by just a little bit so that when I put the plug in place, it can actually find a seal, because I put these little ribs all the way around the outside of the window frame so that the MDF can seal against them. I also put a little bit of foam in there so that I'd get a nice tight seal. And then I got these little locking mechanisms here that you would normally put on like a workbench or something like that. But I used this to hold it into place so that I'm getting a nice tight seal at all times. And of course, all I have to do is just pop the back of the handle off and slide the plug out of the window, and I'm good to go. I'm really happy with the way it turned out. I mentioned before that I need to bend that MDF so that it lines up with the rest of the wall, but that's not a big deal. I also want to paint these handles black so that they blend in a little bit better. But really, it's also nice to have a fire escape in the room, just in case something ever goes wrong in the house. I can pull that plug out and climb out. So overall, I'm happy with the way this turned out. And honestly, the soundproofing on the outside of the house is significantly better than it was beforehand, just using the window. Basically, you can hardly hear anything when you're just standing out in the open on the outside. So really, it turned out pretty well. The sixth struggle that I had when putting this studio together was I had to figure out a way around the lumber costs. I built this during COVID, and 2x4s went up from, the $2 to $3 range up to around the $7, $8 range. And so that was a big thing that I had to get around. And fortunately, when building a studio, there are a couple of things I was able to do to save some money. The first thing I did was I made all of the wall framing 24 on center. Normally when you're framing a wall, you do 16 on center, but this extra few inches made a big deal because, number one, I could have more insulation instead of lumber. The insulation is going to stop sound. Lumber is going to transfer sound as it vibrates and makes contact with the structures. So that was a good thing. The other thing I did was I used 2x3s where I could. And the reason this was helpful is because 2x3s cost significantly less than 2x4s. I think I ended up saving somewhere around $3 per piece of lumber as I put this together, so that was pretty helpful. The last thing I did was I had to get around the problems that come with using 2x3s. When you're building a studio and you are using stick frame lumber, the problem that you can run into is you can actually turn your studio into a resonator. If the drywall is vibrating because there's no support, or if the the lumber starts to vibrate because it's not stiff enough, that can create problems for you. But fortunately, behind all of the 2x3s, I had concrete walls. On the one wall that I had to add in, it was actually helpful that I was able to get some 2x6s for free. And the great thing about this is that the 2x6s were actually true 2x6s. If you go to Lowe's and you buy a 2x4, the dimensions are not actually 2 inches by 4 inches. It's much smaller. But these 2x6s that I used were actually true 2x6. And so that actually beefed up the structure, which prevented vibration once it got to the outer wall. And I think that that was really helpful, not only because it was free, but because it made my structure stronger, which actually makes it more soundproof. The seventh thing I had to worry about was thinking into the future. So we had a water heater that was installed in 2004, and so I knew it was on its last leg. Problem was, it wasn't totally done yet. It was working fine. We didn't have any leaks or anything. And so I knew that eventually I was going to put in a tankless water heater, and so I decided, well, I'm just going to go ahead and bite the bullet and do it now, because I wanted to run PVC venting over where the studio was going to be. And so I went ahead, I ordered it, I installed it, and got that all done first. And it created a couple of other challenges because now I have these two giant PVC lines running through the ceiling, which was going to, kind of inhibit some of my soundproofing for a couple of reasons. Number one, it takes up a lot of space between the joists, and so I had to figure out how I was going to soundproof in there. Fortunately, I was able to wedge some of the safe and sound insulation between there, and I had already gotten the subfloor sealed up above it before I actually put the pipes in. But the other struggle that comes with this is I had to actually poke a pretty sizable hole in the wall. And actually, it could have been 2 holes in the wall. But I went and I got myself a concentric venting kit. And what this does is it takes the 2 lines and puts them into one line, so that basically one line runs on the inside of the other. So I only had to poke 1 hole in the wall. And that was good because that helps me for soundproofing. You don't want more holes in your wall. You need it to be as solid as possible. And as I mentioned before, outside you can hardly hear anything. And so it ended up not being a problem. And it's really nice to be able to have hot water all over the house whenever you need it. The other problem that this caused was because I was covering over the drain with the studio, and this water heater is actually a condensing unit, so it was always creating condensation that comes out of the bottom that you have to drain. I had to figure out what I was going to do with that condensate. And so I ended up installing this pump that pumps everything back over into the studio and down into the drain. And it's actually been working great, and it hasn't bothered me at all. And it was a pretty good solution overall to be able to get a hot water heater that was tankless, to have it be a condensing unit where I'm pumping the condensate where I need to, and build a studio over the drain. It actually all worked out pretty good. The 8th issue that I had to face is, again, one if you're building in a basement, you're probably going to have to deal with, and that's that I had exposed joists up above. Basically, I couldn't cut out those joists and rebuild everything the way I wanted to, so I had to deal with it just as is. It ended up being helpful because I had access to all the things I needed to run, like vents for the hot water heater, but it was still a challenge to figure out how I'm going to soundproof something that already exists and was never designed to be soundproof. And so basically I sealed the subfloor up above, I got the safe and sound that fit the 16 on center that the joists were, and then I installed resilient channel. The resilient channel ended up working out pretty well. What it does is it reduces the number of contact points between the drywall and the joist. If you just install drywall directly against the joist, any vibration that the drywall picks up is going to directly transfer to the joist. However, if it's directly transferring to resilient channel, which is only sometimes in contact with the floor joist, that minimizes the impact noise that you can hear. And so it ended up being helpful, but it did create one big problem for me. The big problem that I had with Open Joists is that when I installed the new wall that created the hallway next to my studio, I had these big wide openings up above the top plate of the frame, and I had to plug them up. And I was really frustrated trying to figure out what I was going to do about it. And then I realized that the floor joists were made out of 2x10s, and I realized, then why don't I just get a 2x10, cut it to size, and wedge it up in there? And that's what I ended up doing on the inside wall. It worked out pretty well. I had to make some special notches and stuff like that to get around pipes and wiring and things like that. But ultimately it got in there. I sealed it up with silicone and foam where it needed to be. And honestly, it came out pretty good. On the exterior portion of that wall, what I ended up using was some pretty thick foam insulation. I actually got my dad to help me. He cut out the shapes. And then again, we had to notch it and put it up there and then seal it with foam. And so it worked out great. I have no complaints. The ninth challenge that I had to face was actually this radon pipe that was installed right before we bought the house. Now, the fact that it was, put into this big hole in the ground means that I really can't move it. And so what I decided to do was I tried to take the wall as close to that pipe as I possibly could so that I could keep the studio as big as I possibly could. And that worked out pretty well, except that I took the framing over a little bit too far and I couldn't use 5/8" drywall on the outside of the framing. I ended up having to double drywall with 1/2" drywall, which is not as good, but basically it ended up working out great because, again, when I'm standing in the hallway, it's pretty darn noise proof. I think that the biggest point of leakage is actually the ceiling, so that wall worked out great. Ultimately, I ended up just kind of boxing in the radon, and I put a little access plate on it so that if anybody ever needs to get in there and check and make sure that the fan is working, you can. And there's really no reason to ever have to get in there and actually manipulate the PVC pipe unless it cracks or something for some reason. But it's encased in framing and drywall, so it probably never will. And all of the components, the motor and things like that for the fan is all outside. So really, all you have to do is open the plate, you can see if things are working, and then you're kind of good to go. So I think it was the best solution. It makes the hallway definitely look better so you don't have this ugly PVC radon pipe sticking in the room. And I'm really happy with the way that it turned out. And the 10th and final challenge that I faced when trying to plan all this stuff out was the fact that in this room, there was a furnace and a hot water heater. And I stood down here for hours looking around trying to figure out how the heck I'm going to soundproof this room with those two things in it. Ultimately, what I decided to do was add a hallway there so that I didn't have to soundproof anything by those. And I think that that was the right thing to do. In the end, it keeps an access way to go from the base of the stairs to the guest bedroom. It enables me to still have access to those things behind these louvered doors. And it also keeps those two heat-producing units out of my studio so it doesn't get too hot in here. It also doesn't create any noise in my studio. And because I had to cover those things with louvered doors, I was able to add another section which ended up serving as storage for all the stuff in my studio. So I can keep extra amps and cables and stands and stuff like that in there without having to store them in my tiny little studio. After all is said and done, I am really happy with the way my studio turned out. I love it. I am down here every day editing videos, playing the drums, whatever, and I'm pretty sure that for the rest of my life, wherever I live, I'm going to need to have a studio. The only thing that I would really do different is I would probably build it separate, which would eliminate pretty much every single one of those problems that I had to face. And that's going to do it for this video. If this was helpful to you, I'd appreciate it if you consider liking it and subscribing to my channel because this is the kind of stuff that I like to tackle. And with that, I hope you have a great day and we'll see you on the next video.